I still remember the day she showed up on my doorstep. It was too early for any neighborly courtesy, yet the incessant ringing of my doorbell felt like an alarm designed to drive me out of bed by sheer irritation. I opened the door halfway, and there she was. A blonde woman in her 50s, thin lips set in a disapproving line, eyes scanning me like I was a rogue invader on her territory. "I'm Karen, president of the Chestnut Grove Homeowners Association. You must be the new tenant." Her voice bristled with finality, as though she had decided exactly who I was without any input from me. I tried to explain that I owned the house and wasn't renting at all, but she cut me off mid-sentence with a raised palm and a dismissive glance. "Please don't argue. Our records show a purchase under an LLC, which often means absentee landlords. We don't allow that nonsense here. Kindly provide your lease." I felt a sudden flash of irritation, but I stayed calm. From her posture to her tone, everything about this encounter reeked of condescension. I sighed and assured her there must have been a misunderstanding, but she only clicked her tongue in disapproval, leaving me with a neon seller notice she slapped onto my door. A notice threatening fines for non-owner occupancy. I watched her walk away, that stiff gait and determined stride telling me she believed she was the supreme judge of all that transpired in Chestnut Grove. I had no clue her tyranny would reach such absurd extremes. Nor did she realize one day she'd have to hand me a check for the very mortgage she never knew I owned. I moved to Chestnut Grove for the peace and quiet. The property was close to my work at a nearby environmental agency, which suited me perfectly. This quaint suburb had large maple trees and a small protected wetland behind some of the houses, providing a unique ecosystem for birds and small wildlife. When I first found the listing online, I was enchanted by the possibility of coexisting with nature, while still enjoying the convenience of a neighborhood less than an hour from the city. Because I worked extensively with ecological surveys, I appreciated the care the previous owner had taken to protect the wetlands. It aligned with my passion for preserving local habitats. So without hesitation, I finalized my purchase through an LLC. My father had recommended it for liability reasons, especially because I occasionally used the property for small nature workshops. When I arrived, I envisioned a calm life. Ironically, that dream was shattered within a week by the shrill blasts of Karen's crusade. First, she insisted my mailbox was half an inch too tall. Then she complained about a bird feeder in my backyard, encouraging too much wildlife. An accusation that sounded ridiculous, given that we literally lived by a wetland. Every day felt more surreal. Each morning brought a new note pinned on my door about some imaginary violation. Meanwhile, I tried to keep my interactions polite, but she treated me like a pest that needed extermination. My first real confrontation occurred on a bright Saturday when I was trimming my hedges. She marched up to me, arms crossed, demanding that I remove the solar lights that lined my walkway. "Solar lights create uneven lighting aesthetics. Your walkway's brightness disrupts uniformity," she stated, nearly spitting out the words. I had never encountered that kind of hostility over something so trivial. I started suspecting something deeper at play, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Little did I know, the HOA board, under her command, was involved in far more serious dealings behind the scenes. That weekend, I attended my first official HOA meeting. To my shock, Karen began the session by singling me out in front of everyone. "We have a new occupant who may not even be an owner," she announced, scowling in my direction. "Let's not let this degrade our community." The tension in the room was palpable. A few neighbors shot me apologetic glances, but most seemed afraid to speak up. The meeting itself was bizarre. Karen rattled off a series of new recommendations that, in truth, were rules disguised as suggestions. She was adamant about uniform paint colors, identical landscaping, and severely limiting any personal expression in yard decorations. I kept wondering how she justified such draconian measures. At some point, a neighbor named Vanessa politely asked if the HOA budget included maintenance for the communal fountain in the Central Park, but Karen waved her off, as if she'd asked about extraterrestrials living among us. We'll get to that eventually. First, we must address the infiltration of rental elements, Karen said, her eyes drifting toward me again. I sat there, arms folded, biting my tongue, fully aware I had a valid deed to my house. I wasn't renting. I wasn't flipping. I had no intention of subletting. Yet, there I was, under suspicion by a woman who seemed to thrive on making me uncomfortable. I tried to speak during the open forum, but Karen cut me off, claiming time constraints. At the end, she looked at me with a faint smirk that implied, "You're in my territory now." It was humiliating, but I maintained my composure. I knew I'd eventually prove her wrong. What I didn't realize was how deeply her actions affected the entire neighborhood, or how far she'd go to enforce her self-appointed rules. During those early days, I spent my time settling into the house. I put up a simple bird feeder, hung a few wind chimes near my patio, and installed a small compost bin to manage organic waste. The compost was part of my personal effort to reduce trash and feed my garden more naturally. But to Karen, it was a biohazard inviting rodents. She showed up one afternoon, pointing at the bin with an accusatory stare. "You're bringing vermin into our community. This will bring diseases," she asserted, flipping open her clipboard. I calmly explained how composting worked, how it actually enriches the soil, and how properly maintained compost doesn't attract pests. She wasn't having any of it. Within hours, I got an email from the HOA that said my compost bin violated environmental standards set by their internal guidelines, which was laughable given my entire background in ecological science. Meanwhile, I noticed some suspicious activity near the wetlands behind the row of houses. Surveyors were prowling around with large stakes, marking lines that extended into the protected area. When I tried to ask them, they just mumbled something about future development and hurried off. I suspected that the HOA might be working with a local developer, and the wetlands, despite being protected, could be at risk. But I needed more proof, so I started documenting everything: the random stakes, the overzealous surveys, the disapproving letters from Karen. Something told me these events weren't isolated. Karen wanted me gone, or at least wanted me to conform to her petty demands without question. Perhaps she believed I'd be easier to manipulate if she labeled me a renter, or maybe she was determined to root out anyone who might oppose her unspoken agenda. The plot thickened a week later. I received a letter in the mail, not from the HOA, but from the local municipal office, stating there would be a hearing about potential rezoning of a section of Chestnut Grove's wetland border. The timing felt too coincidental. I decided to attend that hearing, suspecting that some members of the HOA board might be in on it. When I arrived at the municipal building, I saw Karen whispering with a councilman just outside the main room. She shot me a dirty look when she saw me approach. I picked a seat near the back, listening carefully to the proposals and amendments they were reading. Indeed, the rezoning would allow limited commercial development near the wetlands, which alarmed me. Developer representatives stood up to speak about constructing a small cluster of luxury townhomes that would respect the natural environment while providing modern amenities. I nearly scoffed out loud. It was typical corporate greenwashing language, words like sustainability and low impact. But behind them likely lurked profit-driven exploitation. Karen stepped up to the microphone at some point, introducing herself as the president of the Chestnut Grove HOA. She claimed the majority of the neighborhood supported some measure of progress, and that those outside elements who contested these expansions were simply not well informed. I sat there, my blood boiling. She was effectively advocating for building on or near protected land, and she had the nerve to refer to people like me who wanted to preserve the wetlands as outsiders. That hearing ended with no final decision But the seeds were planted. It became clear that Karen was pushing some personal or financial agenda, and my presence as a new occupant wasn't part of her plan. Worse yet, my knowledge of environmental law might pose a threat to her if I started raising questions about whether the development violated local conservation statutes. She needed to undermine me. Labeling me a renter and discrediting my status in the community was just the opening salvo. All the while, as if to ensure I remained distracted, I began receiving a barrage of daily violation letters. One day it was your recycling bins are visible from the street, must be stored out of sight. The next, your grass is exceeding the neighborhood's recommended length by half an inch. Then, lawn ornaments not matching the Chestnut Grove aesthetic guidelines. The letters were always signed by Karen, personally. It reached absurd levels when she told me to remove a small decorative plaque dedicated to my late mother's memory because it could lower property values. At that point, I decided enough was enough. I hired an attorney to review the HOA bylaws, my property deed, and to see if there was a pattern of harassment. He discovered something intriguing. The board had approved a bylaw making it easier to fine non-owner residents, but they had never filed that bylaw with the county clerk's office as required. In other words, they were acting on an unregistered rule that had no legal basis outside their internal circle. My attorney suggested we hold that information in reserve for now, using it only when absolutely necessary. He suspected that the board, especially Karen, was pushing boundaries that could crumble under scrutiny. I kept that knowledge to myself, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, I started digging into the developer's background, the local councilman's ties to the HOA, and any financial incentives that might be swirling behind closed doors. If Karen was trying to push me out, maybe it was because I had the potential to become a vocal opponent. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this was about a grander scheme. Exploiting a portion of the wetland, ignoring environmental safeguards, and pocketing money from new, high-priced properties that would line the border. The scariest part was that these actions had direct consequences for local wildlife, flood control, and the overall health of the ecosystem. But Karen showed no sign of caring about that. She had an unwavering focus on total compliance to her will. That in itself hinted that something else was fueling her besides the typical HOA means well mentality. In the midst of this tension, I found an unlikely ally in an older resident named Henry, a retiree who'd lived in Chestnut Grove since its inception. He approached me one late afternoon while I was inspecting some newly placed boundary flags near the wetland. He tapped me on the shoulder gently. I turned around, half expecting yet another scolding, but instead I saw a worried expression on his weathered face. "Karen's up to no good, son," he said in a low voice. "I've been here from the start, watched that woman climb her way into the board. She sweet-talked the older members, promised them tax breaks, more amenities, you name it. Then she started controlling the budget, calling the shots. I don't trust her as far as I can throw her." I asked him about the wetland, and Henry revealed a crucial piece of history. Years ago, the original developer had tried to build a shopping center on that land, but public outcry and environmental regulations halted it. The area was deemed ecologically sensitive, and it was supposed to remain protected indefinitely. Henry suspected Karen was aligning with new investors who found a workaround, an obscure rezoning measure that might let them chip away at the protected status. She's pressuring folks who won't stand by her plan, trying to label them troublemakers. Don't let her push you out. "We need someone who understands the environmental side," Henry confided. I felt both relieved and a bit overwhelmed. I thanked him for the intel, determined not to let Karen's intimidation succeed. Her labeling me a renter was her way of delegitimizing my voice in the HOA. She wanted me to appear transient, less credible. But ironically, she had no clue about the mortgage twist that would soon flip everything on its head. Karen's arrogance reached new heights about a month later. She called an emergency HOA meeting complaining about an influx of undesirable elements that threatened to tarnish Chestnut Grove's reputation. Her biggest example? my property. She flashed a slideshow of photos, my solar lights, my bird feeder, my compost bin, and insisted I was inviting vermin and decreasing property values. The rhetoric was vicious. She implied I might be subletting rooms to suspicious individuals. I sat through the meeting in stunned silence until she demanded I stand and explain my lease. That's when I calmly pulled out my property deed. I announced that I was in fact the full owner and had never once leased the place to anyone else. She tried to mask her surprise, but the room noticed the flicker of confusion in her eyes. She pivoted, claiming she must have had incomplete records and that an audit would be forth. This charade, ironically, set me on a path to discover something even more critical. After the meeting, I was approached by a neighbor named Paige, a single mother who was nearly in tears. She confided that Karen had harassed her for weeks about late HOA dues, except Paige insisted she'd paid on time. Paige showed me her receipts, and sure enough, everything was in order. But Karen threatened liens, fines, and even legal action. Paige was afraid of losing her home. This revelation convinced me Karen was abusing her power financially. And that's when I asked my attorney to dig deeper into the HOA's finances. The next week, we uncovered a web of questionable transactions. Karen had used HOA funds to pay for consulting services from a firm suspiciously linked to the same developer eyeing the wetland. The puzzle pieces were aligning. The hostility toward me made sense now. Karen was consolidating control, punishing neighbors who questioned her, and orchestrating a stealth project to hand over the wetland for development. She needed to keep critics at bay, and I was quickly becoming her biggest threat. Yet none of this compared to the bombshell I discovered about her personal mortgage. It happened almost by accident. Through my line of work and some networking, I found a list of properties in Chestnut Grove with second liens that had gone into default or near debt mark status in the past decade. Karen's house popped up. Apparently, her husband, who had passed away years ago, took out a second mortgage to invest in some ill-fated venture. Karen had continued paying the primary mortgage, but the second mortgage changed hands multiple times through various lenders. I tracked it down, made some inquiries, and learned that the current lien holder was a private investment group looking to offload certain assets, including a handful of second mortgages in default. My attorney and I conferred if we acquired that lien, we would effectively have the power to foreclose on Karen's home if she continued her harassment and if she missed payments. It was a legal chess move, one that would only be justified if she kept pushing her agenda of intimidation and corruption. I wasn't out for revenge just for the sake of it, but I believed stopping her might be the only way to preserve the wetland and protect the community from her manipulations. It took about 3 weeks of paperwork, negotiations, and background checks, but eventually I purchased the second lien on Karen's property. The day it became official, I felt a twinge of guilt. I'm not someone who revels in controlling someone else's fate. But Karen had gone too far with her callous treatment of neighbors. Her readiness to destroy the protected environment for personal gain, her willingness to evict single mothers over bogus fees. In my mind, acquiring that mortgage was a defensive measure, like carrying a bigger stick, should she choose to fight dirty. Of course, Karen remained in the dark about all this. She was too busy planning her next blitz against me. She stepped up her campaign by circulating flyers that claimed my property was a hotbed of illegal activity. The rumors got so outlandish, accusing me of operating an unlicensed wildlife sanctuary or storing hazardous materials, that even some of the residents who usually sided with Karen found it difficult to swallow. Nevertheless, she managed to rally enough loyalists that the HOA board formally voted to fine me $500, 0 cents a day until I removed the bird feeder and solar lights. My attorney responded with a cease and desist letter, pointing out the unfiled bylaw and threatening legal action if they persisted with this nonsense. That should have given her pause, but arrogance blinded her. She seemed convinced she could bully me into backing down. presumably so the developer's plan could steamroll forward without any friction. Meanwhile, Henry tipped me off that Karen was frantic behind closed doors. She'd started calling emergency board meetings, pressuring people to sign non-disclosure agreements about the upcoming rezoning. The more desperate she became, the more blatant her power moves were. But the real moment of truth came when I watched her parade onto my property with two so-called inspectors. They marched around my yard taking pictures and scribbling notes. They taped a bright orange notice to my front window labeling my home a public nuisance. That was it. I decided to reveal my trump card. I had my attorney send her a formal notice reminding her of her second mortgage responsibilities. The notice stated quite firmly that she was delinquent on the latest payment and faced potential foreclosure if she did not rectify it immediately. Just as I had anticipated, confusion soon turned into panic on her end. We heard from a third party that she was frantically calling the bank, trying to understand why she owed more than she thought. That's when she learned, presumably with horror, that the second lien had been sold to a new entity, my LLC. Her reaction was swift and it was nasty. At the next HOA meeting, she launched into a tirade about outside vultures buying up local debts to undermine our community. She cast me as a predatory investor who was trying to seize her home. The hypocrisy was glaring. She had been hounding me relentlessly, calling me a renter and an undesirable. Now the tables were turned and she wanted sympathy, but some of the neighbors, particularly those who had seen her tyranny firsthand, started to question her narrative. They wondered if maybe there was more to the story, especially since she had consistently singled me out from day one. Many neighbors had no idea about her financial entanglements, nor did they realize the wetland was at risk. I used this shift in public sentiment to my advantage, politely explaining that I'd purchased her lien as a strategic measure because of her repeated harassment and questionable actions. While I didn't broadcast it widely, I let it slip that her alliance with the developer might be jeopardizing the entire neighborhood's well-being. It sparked curiosity. People began digging into HOA documents. Some started complaining more openly about unaccounted fees. In a way, Karen's fiasco unintentionally united a portion of the community against her. Meanwhile, she tried to intimidate me with threats of litigation. She even filed a lawsuit accusing me of malicious intent, but the suit was laughably weak. My attorney responded with evidence of her relentless campaign against me. Stacks of violation notices, recordings of her walking onto my property with unauthorized inspectors, the fraudulent flyers. The case was dismissed so quickly that Karen's face turned beet red in the courtroom. She stormed out without uttering a word. Yet, no matter how many losses she racked up, she refused to stop. On some level, I almost admired her resilience, twisted though it was. She believed she was unstoppable, that her position as HOA president meant she was judge, jury, and executioner. By this stage, the broader conflict came into full view. The developer was pressuring the municipality to vote on the rezoning soon. Karen, with her influence in Chestnut Grove, was a key voice expected to endorse the plan. She'd stoke fear in residents, claiming property values would plummet if they didn't modernize, or that taxes would skyrocket without the new development. The few who opposed her faced immediate retribution. A mild-mannered teacher, Mr. Lowry, dared to speak against rezoning, worried it would lead to destruction of local habitats. He found himself slapped with multiple bogus violations within days. Something about his fence being too tall. His car parked a few inches off the official line. It was the same pattern repeated. However, with me still in the picture, and with my newly acquired leverage, Karen's power was no longer absolute. People began approaching me for advice. Paige, the single mother, asked if I could review some new charges on her HOA bill. I directed her to my attorney, who found them baseless. Henry was furious about under-the-table decisions being made without official board votes. So we organized a mini coalition to demand transparency. We insisted the HOA open its financial records to the community. Karen tried to refuse, but our lawyer reminded her that HOA finances must be accessible to homeowners upon request. The tension came to a head at a special meeting that Karen begrudgingly called, presumably to quell the uprising. Instead, the meeting became an inquisition into her leadership. Several neighbors demanded to see the missing funds that were allocated for the community's drainage system. Others wanted details about the so-called consulting fees. The atmosphere crackled with outrage. Karen tried to regain control, banging a gavel on the table, but the crowd wouldn't be silenced. Right then, city officials arrived with updated documentation, including an environmental impact statement that cast serious doubt on the developer's claims. The statement indicated that any new construction along the wetland border would threaten the water table and local wildlife. Public outcry soared. People were starting to see Karen as a self-serving figure who either naively or willfully ignored the ecological consequences, pushing for a deal that would pad someone's pockets at the expense of the entire neighborhood. Still, Karen clung to her illusions of grandeur. She downplayed the environmental report, claiming it was based on outdated data, even though the city's environmental specialist, who happened to be a colleague of mine, was standing right there, ready to testify otherwise. At that point, I realized we needed a definitive blow to shatter her credibility once and for all. Thanks to Henry, I got hold of archived HOA meeting minutes from a decade earlier, which explicitly stated the wetland was permanently off limits for any development, as it was legally recognized as an ecologically sensitive zone. Karen was on the board at that time, which meant she was fully aware of this restriction. Clearly, she had buried those records to push forward with her new agenda. I leaked that information to a local journalist who had been covering municipal affairs. The next morning, an article exposing hidden documents and HOA shenanigans made it onto the local newspaper's website. It described how certain members of the Chestnut Grove HOA leadership had suppressed or ignored the original environmental agreement. Karen was quoted as having previously acknowledged the land's protected status, which directly contradicted her recent public statements. Almost overnight, calls for her resignation flooded the neighborhood's online forums. Even her usual loyalists went silent or distanced themselves, afraid of being dragged into the scandal. Meanwhile, the city council postponed any rezoning decision until further investigation, a devastating blow to the developer. And amid this swirling chaos, I quietly reminded Karen, through my attorney, that her next mortgage installment under that second lien was due. With her reputation crumbling, she faced mounting pressure to pay up or risk foreclosure. Finally, she was the one pinned against the wall. She attempted one last desperate gambit, a smear campaign accusing me of forging the second mortgage documents. She produced a flimsy pamphlet filled with random allegations. It was riddled with errors and laughable leaps of logic, insisting that I was an environmental extremist who wanted to seize power in the neighborhood and sabotage economic growth. Normally, I'd ignore such nonsense, but my attorney advised me to respond decisively to end her theatrics. We filed a defamation claim, supplying the court with an avalanche of evidence showing her pattern of harassment, her knowledge of the legitimate second lien, and her orchestrated acts of defamation. The judge sided with us, issuing a stern warning to Karen to cease and desist her attempts to undermine my ownership rights. The next time we encountered each other was at the mailbox cluster. She glanced at me, a flicker of hatred and desperation in her eyes. I could see she was contemplating whether to lash out or remain silent. She opted for silence, grabbing her mail and spinning away with that rigid posture of hers, as though the mere act of acknowledging me was beneath her. I felt a tension simmering beneath that quiet moment. Here we were, two individuals locked in a standoff that had escalated beyond a personal feud into a battle for an entire community's future. As more residents learned about the plan to encroach on the wetland, a grassroots movement formed. Neighbors put signs in their yards declaring, "Protect our marsh, protect our homes." Suddenly, the conversation shifted from Karen's petty violations to the bigger picture, preserving the neighborhood's natural assets, ensuring a safe water table, preventing corrupt development. A sense of solidarity flourished where before there had only been fear. Page organized a petition demanding the HOA back down from endorsing the rezoning, and she easily amassed enough signatures to hold a formal vote on the issue. This forced Karen's hand. She had to convene an official HOA vote, open to all homeowners. At that special assembly, nearly 3/4 of the residents voted to reject any partnership with the developer and reaffirmed the neighborhood's commitment to preserving the wetlands under the existing legal protections. Karen tried to object, but the people had spoken. In a final dramatic twist, her position as HOA president was called into question. A group of residents, led by Henry, introduced a motion to remove her due to misconduct and concealment of crucial documents. It passed by a landslide. Karen was removed from her seat that very night, replaced by an interim president who vowed a new era of transparency. Some board members resigned immediately out of shame or complicity. Others promised to do better. In the aftermath, the developer pulled away, citing political headwinds. The city council closed the rezoning request, labeling it non-viable. The wetlands remained untouched, a victory not just for the environment, but for everyone who wanted to see our neighborhood live up to its potential as a green, healthy space. You might think that was the end of Karen's saga, but ironically, her biggest humiliation was yet to come. Without the developer's backing, she lost whatever financial arrangement she might have had in the works. Soon after, I heard rumors she had trouble making her monthly payments, including the second lien I owned. Sure enough, 2 months later, my attorney informed me she was behind on her obligations again. We sent another polite but firm notice. This time she actually called my office, something she'd never done before, and left a long, rambling voicemail about how this was all a misunderstanding, how she was under temporary financial strain, and how she deserved empathy. Her tone was night and day from the arrogant bully I'd known. I considered letting the attorneys handle everything, but I felt a need to speak to her directly. Part of me wanted closure. Part of me wanted to see if she'd learned anything from this ordeal. When I picked up her next call, she didn't recognize my voice right away. "Are you the man in charge of this LLC?" she asked. I took a breath. "Yes, Karen, it's me, your so-called renter." She fell silent. The seconds stretched on, and I could practically feel her mortification through the phone. Finally, she muttered something about being willing to negotiate, to figure out a payment plan. She blamed unforeseen circumstances and tried to paint herself as a victim of unfortunate timing. Well, I didn't relish kicking someone out of their home. I also believed accountability mattered. If she came to me respectfully, willing to pay her debts and stop tormenting the community, I was open to reaching a fair arrangement. In the end, she managed to catch up on her arrears, but the power dynamic was irrevocably shifted. The HOA queen, who'd tried to chase me out, was now beholden to me, making monthly payments that reminded her of the cost of tyranny. That alone was a poetic sort of justice. With Karen dethroned, the HOA began to rebuild. A new board was elected. Committees were formed to ensure that rules were fairly applied, focusing on genuine communal needs, like upgrading the playground, beautifying the park, and discussing real solutions for any environmental concerns. Page stepped up to head the finance committee, ensuring no more suspicious transactions slipped by. Henry was invited to serve in an advisory capacity, sharing his historical knowledge of Chestnut Grove. The mood around the neighborhood transformed from one of constant tension to a sense of possibility. Neighbors started organizing block parties, planting trees near the wetland, and some folks even installed small pollinator gardens. I was asked to lead an environmental stewardship program, teaching residents about composting, native plants, and how to coexist with wildlife. Instead of condemning bird feeders, we distributed pamphlets on how to maintain them responsibly. It was everything I had hoped for when I first bought my home. A community united not by fear, but by shared purpose. And while Karen still lived there, she mostly kept to herself. Sometimes I'd see her walking around the block, head lowered, a faint scowl on her face. She passed people without her old air of superiority, more like a deflated figure than the intimidating presence she once was. One afternoon, a few months after the dust settled, I was working in my yard, planting new native shrubs to create a bird-friendly corridor. Karen approached me slowly. I braced for an unpleasant exchange, but she looked tired, as if she carried a heavy burden. "I'm not here to fight," she said quietly. The tension in her voice gave it away that this conversation was difficult for her. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for it to go that far. She trailed off, struggling to maintain eye contact. I stayed silent, letting her find her words. "The truth is, I was desperate," she continued. She explained how she'd been manipulated by the developer with promises of financial backing, how she believed that if she could push through the rezoning, she'd secure funds to stabilize her mortgage, possibly even remodel her home. She confessed that she let her personal insecurities fester into a vendetta against me. Someone new, someone who seemed beyond her control. I listened, uncertain if I felt sympathy or just relief at hearing her finally admit to wrongdoing. In the end, I told her it was up to the community whether they forgave her or not, but at least now I understood how fear and desperation could warp a person. She nodded meekly, then walked away, shoulders slumped, as if the weight of everything was pulling her down. In the following weeks, I remained cordial but distant. The residents who suffered under her regime each handled it differently. Some forgave, others harbored resentment. Karen eventually attended a few HOA gatherings, though she sat quietly in the back, not offering any loud opinions. It seemed she had learned humility, but it was a lesson that came at a steep cost. Word spread that she'd sold her designer furniture and a couple of heirlooms to pay off debts. There were rumors that the developer had left her with some bills after their partnership collapsed. All these details painted a picture of a woman who had gambled everything on a scheme fueled by arrogance, only to watch it all crumble. Meanwhile, Chestnut Grove flourished. Thanks to a series of grants from the state's environmental department, we initiated a restoration project for the wetland, removing invasive species, planting more native vegetation, and setting up educational signs. Families flocked to see the ducks and herons nesting in newly secured habitats. School children visited on field trips to learn about local ecology, marveling at the tadpoles and wildflowers. The shift was remarkable. People took pride in where they lived, feeling that they were part of something bigger. No longer was the HOA synonymous with petty fines and authoritarian control. It became a genuine community organization that organized cleanup days, potluck dinners, and even a small farmers market that allowed local produce vendors to set up stands near the community park. If anyone brought up the name Karen, it was typically to remark how everything changed after her downfall. A cautionary tale about what happens when power gets abused. As for me, life settled into a steady rhythm of work, community projects, and personal pursuits. I grew closer to neighbors I hardly knew before. Vanessa, who volunteered to run a reading club for kids. Mr. Lowry, the teacher who assisted me with an outreach program about wetlands. I poured my energy into making the best of the property I once considered just a peaceful place for myself. It ended up becoming so much more, a focal point of environmental awareness, a home base for enthusiastic neighbors who wanted to preserve our local ecosystem. Sometimes I'd smile, remembering the irony that Karen had once labeled me the renter, the outsider. Little did she know she was unknowingly galvanizing me to take ownership in a way I never expected, not just of my house, but also of the community's destiny. A full year passed since Karen was voted out, and her mortgage remained partially under my watchful LSC. she never missed a payment again. Occasionally, she'd leave the monthly check in my mailbox with an envelope that just read HOA dues plus mortgage, a small sign of her acceptance of the situation. Occasionally, a pang of empathy would hit me. She was stuck in a reality where every check she wrote reminded her of her downfall. Yet, if she'd chosen differently at any point, if she had welcomed me as a neighbor instead of treating me like an enemy, if she'd not conspired with that developer and neglected the environment, she might have had a very different life. Instead, she had to walk these streets every day, surrounded by people who knew her story. There was a sort of poetic justice in that. But I never gloated openly. I believed we all have our failings, and maybe this was her path to becoming a better person, even if it was a harsh road. One sunny morning in late spring, I was out back checking the progress of some new saplings when a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. I recognized the driver's face from earlier times. He was one of the developer's representatives. He pulled up alongside my driveway, gave me a curt nod, and said, "Hey, I remember you. So this is your place, huh?" There was no malice in his voice, maybe just curiosity. "Yes, it's home," I replied. He glanced around, noticing the vibrant greenery and the sign that read, "Wetland Restoration in Progress." In a softer tone than I expected, he said, "I never meant to cause destruction, you know. It was just business." Then he shrugged and drove off. I stood there for a moment, reflecting on how many times just business tramples communities, nature, and individuals. But in Chestnut Grove, at least, people had stood up and said no. We proved that a single homeowner, mislabeled as a renter, could galvanize change against seemingly unstoppable forces: development, corruption, the arrogance of power. And in doing so, I found a deeper sense of belonging and purpose than any neat suburban life might have offered under normal circumstances. Today, I'm writing these final notes from my sunlit kitchen. The windows open to a view of red-winged blackbirds darting among cattails by the water's edge, living proof that the wetland remains safe. The air carries the scent of fresh grass, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil after a light rain. I can hear distant laughter from children playing near the park. Sometimes, the memory of Karen's early morning knocks or her stern clipboard-toting persona flashes through my mind, but it feels almost like a past life. No longer do I receive petty violation notices or find threatening letters pinned to my door. Instead, my mailbox is filled with community newsletters, invites to neighborly get-togethers, and the occasional thank you note from folks who appreciate the educational tours I host. The new HOA board is well on its way to re-evaluating the old rules, focusing on what truly matters: safety, cleanliness, and fostering a genuine sense of fellowship among residents. That's what I wanted from day one. Ironically, the path to get here involved months of conflict, legal maneuvering, and the unmasking of a corrupt alliance with a powerful developer. Through it all, I learned that the real heart of a neighborhood isn't in uniform fences or meticulously measured lawns. It's in shared values and mutual respect. Karen still lives in the house on the corner, though it's far less ostentatious than it once was. She removed her lavish lawn ornaments, presumably to sell them. The imposing wrought iron gate she'd installed to showcase her status now lies rusting in her backyard. Whenever I pass by, we exchange a civil nod, acknowledging each other's presence but not inviting conversation. Some days I sense she's on the verge of apologizing again, or seeking some form of absolution. Whether I'd grant it is a tricky question. I'm not one to hold grudges indefinitely, yet trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Nonetheless, I prefer to let time and consistent action speak louder than any forced gesture. If she shows genuine regret and an earnest desire to help the community move forward, maybe she can start fresh. For now, though, I think she understands she lost something intangible: public confidence, moral authority, and the simple respect that neighbors grant one another, all for the pursuit of an illusory deal that promised wealth at the expense of nature and decency. I keep the final letter she sent me at the peak of our feud tucked in a folder, her demand that I present a lease agreement or vacate. It's a reminder that illusions of power can be shattered in an instant. I've also framed the original notice I got from the municipal office about the rezoning hearing. It's a testament to the power of civic engagement. Each artifact tells a piece of the story, how a seemingly unstoppable HOA president clashed with the wrong person, how a false narrative about me being a renter spiraled into a legal war, how I ended up holding the lien to Karen's mortgage, and how a determined community saved its wetland. Whenever I share this tale with friends or family, they shake their heads in disbelief, marveling at the complicated tapestry of motives, betrayals, and revelations. But to me, it was just everyday life for nearly a year. An unrelenting swirl of violation notices, secret discoveries, strategic plays, and emotional strain. Looking back, I don't regret any of it. I might wish it had come about in a less adversarial way, but sometimes adversity is what sparks meaningful change. The wetlands remain intact, local wildlife continues to thrive, and the neighborhood no longer cowers under the rule of an overbearing HOA president. Paige is now the proud owner of a newly repainted house, unafraid of random fines. Henry has peace of mind that the land he's cherished for decades won't be bulldozed. And me? I finally have the tranquil suburban home I dreamed of, except with an added layer of purpose. It's more than just a place to eat, sleep, and store my belongings. It's become a beacon for those who value conservation, community spirit, and standing up to unjust authority. Whenever I walk past that wetland and see the sun glinting off the water, reflecting the cattails swaying gently in the breeze, I feel a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the land, for the neighbors who rallied together, and even for the twisted path that forced me to become an active participant in shaping the place I call home. Because in the end, I learned that genuine ownership isn't just about holding a deed, it's about belonging to the land, to each other, and to the ideals that make a neighborhood worth protecting. And maybe that's the ultimate irony. Karen tried so hard to label me a mere renter, but in fighting against her, I found a deeper sense of ownership than any piece of paper or monthly payment could ever provide. So every month, when her check arrives, I deposit it, acknowledging that life has a peculiar way of balancing the scales. She wanted me gone, but she ended up paying me. I wanted peace, but I had to go through conflict to achieve it. And each day, I awake to the chorus of birds, the gentle hum of suburban life, and the satisfying knowledge that sometimes the best way to claim your space in the world is to confront those who question your right to be there. If you had told me months ago that I'd be known around Chestnut Grove as the man who took on the notorious Karen and saved the wetland, I might have laughed. But here I am, living proof that determination, a bit of legal savvy, and a willingness to stand up for what you believe in can topple even the most intimidating of suburban tyrants. And as for Karen, well, she now comprehends the true cost of trying to cast me as a renter when I literally own her mortgage. That's a lesson I suspect she'll never forget.